From tariffs to reshoring to talks of reindustrializing America, there is a lot of talk around whether or not America should rebuild its manufacturing base. And in this video, we're going to talk about the history of this over the last few decades, as well as talk about a potential framework for how we could make decisions on this in the future. Now, I do have to say this video was heavily inspired by Chris Miller's newsletter, Does Manufacturing Matter? I'm going to put a link to that in the description of this video. Highly encourage you to read that after you finish watching this video. And I'm going to reference Chris Miller's work throughout this presentation / video. But it starts here with the early 2000s China. We'll start in the bottom slice of pie here. So trade boom. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, which opened up the door to trade with the West. So now it was easier than ever for foreign firms, specifically in the West, to invest in China. At the same time, money was pretty cheap. So following easing cycles in the early 2000s, and obviously after the global financial crisis, where we had ZIRP, interest rates were low around the world, again, driven by the US. And so money was cheap. China was now open for investment. And at the same time, China experienced a massive working age population boom during the 1990s and 2000s. So this was kind of the perfect storm for companies to move manufacturing to China. Now, because of this demographics boom in China, no one could really compete with China's cost of labor. Now, obviously, there are a lot of reasons that is beyond the scope of this video. But if you look here at the chart of average hourly compensation of manufacturing workers, it's indexed to the US at 100, and there at the time it was $22.87 in 2004. China was well below that number, and its nearest competitors, Brazil and Mexico, were still significantly higher than China. So China was sort of in this league of its own in terms of the amount of people it had and this newfound openness to welcome foreign investment. And so what happened over time? This is the first time I'm taking stuff directly from Chris Miller's newsletter, including a quote in the bottom right corner. Again, link to his newsletter in the description. I really want you to read that. It was awesome. So what happened over this period of time? So as you can see, from 1995 to 2025, again, this data comes from Chris, the share of auto manufacturing here on the left. So the US fell from 25% of the world's auto manufacturing, which was second to only behind Japan and slightly above Germany, all the way down to 10%. And as you can see, in the same period, China went from less than 1% all the way up to 22%. Japan has remained number one. Again, this is projected in 2025. So you might say, oh, this looks bad for the US, right? We lost 15% of our world share of auto manufacturing. However, what this allowed us to do was redistribute our time, energy, and domestic capital into basically growing Silicon Valley. So again, chart on the right or table on the right, this is the tech market capitalization in 1995. US larger than most other people's, although look how close it was to Japan, right? We're only $200 billion only, but only $200 billion on this scale. It is only $1 billion bigger than Japan. And then now you fast forward to 2025, we have a $25 trillion approximately tech market capitalization in the United States. So Chris asks this question, and he does say that it's a little more complicated than how this question is presented in the newsletter. So again, go read it. But I thought this was very poignant. Ask, would you rather have, one, a world in which GM performed just as well as Volkswagen over the past 30 years, or two, Silicon Valley? The answer is obvious. So while yes, our manufacturing capabilities in the United States certainly fell over this period as more and more firms moved their manufacturing capabilities to China. But at the same time, we were able to redistribute our energy into making effectively Silicon Valley. So why are we now talking about this, right? There's clearly some positive trade-offs. There were some negative trade-offs. Things seem to have worked out pretty well for most countries involved. But reshoring became a hot topic in the wake of COVID-19. So here, everything was good until it wasn't. Wasn't something we were really considering 2016, 17, 18, but all of a sudden COVID hits and the interest in reshoring spikes. And NN Investment Partners did a survey on their top 10 reasons. As you can see, it went from not being of interest to all of a sudden, there were all of these potential reasons why companies wanted to potentially reshore or nearshore their manufacturing capabilities. And almost no one was left unscathed when it came to some of the supply chain disruptions that came from COVID-19. So you can see here, this was another analysis done by NN Investment Partners. They looked at the year-over-year change in the share of earnings reports that cited supply chain issues in 2021. And maybe you could say, besides materials and healthcare, if you look at information technology, consumer discretionary, industrials, consumer staples, anywhere from almost 40 to 60% of companies, there was an increase in companies talking about supply chain issues. And there were a lot of forces that exacerbated this. So there was a strong demand for goods. So once we reopened the economy, there was a lot of pent-up demand. That was a phrase that was used a lot. And supply chains were not prepared for all this demand to come online so quickly. There were also labor shortages. People quit their jobs, many Americans in particular, during COVID. There was a lot of stimulus checks, people worried about getting sick. There was a variety of reasons why people either quit their jobs or just flat out retired. And the US had more job openings than workers available to fill them. There are also transportation shortages. So the shipping industry did not have enough ships to meet the demand, the increased demand, and this fueled a surge in shipping costs. Inventories were lean at this time because of these shipping delays. Retailers struggled to supply enough to fulfill the demand. Anecdotally, I moved to Chicago at about this time, and my wife and I were looking to buy a couch, and we were told by almost every place we went that if we wanted to order a couch that wasn't on the floor, it was going to take about 6 to 9 months for that couch to show up. So some pretty crazy stories from that time. And then finally, we had China's COVID lockdown. So lockdowns in China led to reduced manufacturing, a shortage of truck drivers, and basically countless other factors that hurt supply chains across the globe. And now, at this time, if you look at 2022, some of the dynamics have changed. China no longer offers the cheapest labor. This chart is from 2022 from the Reshoring Institute. As you can see, it's lost some of its cost advantages. So it's still cheaper than some of the more developed nations. You can see Germany, US, UK, Spain, and France. But remember some of its closest partners back in 2004 in the initial chart, Brazil and Mexico? Well, it is now more expensive per worker in China than in Brazil and Mexico. And we've heard a lot about other Southeast Asian countries, so Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam. And then the big one recently has been India. And it's no surprise that because of this attention they're getting, that they come in at the lowest, at least on this chart, of cost of labor. So now the question remains, should companies who are looking to diversify their manufacturing base, should they be looking at other areas abroad? Or should they be encouraged to start building more manufacturing capability here in the US? Well, ready or not, here comes the manufacturing spending. So manufacturing spending in the US has boomed. Here on the left, we see private construction spending for the manufacturing industry, and that is a massive jump. And that has really supported the economy over the last few years. There's been a lot of spending in this area. In particular, if you look at the Mag 7, a lot of this is surrounding AI, but they have spent, just those 7 companies, almost $100 billion in capital expenditures in 2024. So now we get into the content from Chris Miller's newsletter. Again, link to that in the description of this video. Finish the video, go read that newsletter. Here, Chris gets into the top 3 reasons that people say we should reshore back to America. and why he doesn't necessarily buy these reasons. And I've provided some charts as well that are sort of based on his reasoning. So reason number one that people give, and I'm sure you've heard this, I've heard this a lot, manufacturing is good for jobs. And here, I'm going to quote Chris from his newsletter here on the right. Manufacturing is only around 10% of employment in the US. And so a 20% increase in manufacturing employment will be negligible at the economy-wide level. Moreover, the only way to manufacture in the US cost effectively is to aggressively automate. So as a theory of policy, manufacturing is good for jobs makes no sense. So here, as you can see on the left, we actually have it at about 8%, so even smaller than Chris says. I'm sure this is just, we're using different series. But this has been due to growing competition, free trade, as we mentioned, and a less productive economy that have all contributed to manufacturing's decline. And what Chris basically says here is if we're going to have competitive manufacturing, so not only would an increase in manufacturing not have a huge impact on our employment situation because it's such a small part of what we do in the US now, if we're going to have any level of competitiveness, we're going to have to automate these factories to a really, really high level. And so that kind of defeats the purpose anyways. We're not going to be hiring as many people for these factories as we traditionally would if we were ever going to compete from a cost perspective. So is manufacturing good for jobs? That argument doesn't really make sense. Number two, manufacturing drives productivity. So here, I also don't think much of the theory that you need a big manufacturing sector to drive productivity improvements in an advanced economy. He goes on to basically say if that were true, Germany would be richer and America would be much poorer. And then later says that he agrees that sometimes economies that are developing might need manufacturing to drive productivity growth. He says this debate has a huge ramifications for India, but currently none for the United States. And so what I have here is manufacturing share of US GDP, and that is only about 10%. As you can see, it's been significantly falling since the late 90s. So to Chris's point, if manufacturing was so important to drive growth, how come as manufacturing share of US GDP has fallen, the US has continued to grow and outpace almost every other country on earth? Finally, manufacturing is geopolitical, and also it helps our defense industry, so in defending our country. And so I'm not going to read this whole quote. You can go through it, but I thought it was worth posting here. Again, for the third time, go read Chris's newsletter after you finish this video. Basically, what Chris says is there's some validity to this argument, right? If you look at chips and rare earth magnets, almost everyone agrees that these things matter. You want some capability to make your own chips and make your own rare earth magnets. Both of these important. And on the flip side, t-shirts don't. So most people, if you're talking, would agree. Even President Trump agrees at this point. We don't need to be making t-shirts and socks in the United States. That's not the point of what we're talking about. However, there is a lot of things in between t-shirts and socks and chips and rare earth magnets. In fact, as Chris says, only $2 trillion of America's imports, of $2 trillion of American imports, only 7% is textile products like clothes and furniture. He goes on to give the percentages for toys, Christmas decorations, etc. But he says at the bottom here, the key remaining categories by complexity and scale are cars, computers, phones, a wide variety of industrial and electronic machinery, chemicals and metal products. And so if you want to say that manufacturing is important for geopolitics and for defense, that is true to some extent, but there's a lot of stuff in the middle that you're going to need to figure out. Does this play into that? Do cars play into it? Do laptops, phones play into it? You're going to need to have a view on these goods and if we should be producing more of them. Now, to end this, Chris asked 4 questions that he wanted answers to in terms of if we should be building more manufacturing capability in the US. So he wanted more information on these 4 questions. I don't know if Chris would call this a framework, but I think this is brilliant, and I'm going to use this effectively as a framework for how I'm going to think about some of the industries that could potentially reshore. So we're going to go through one by one. Again, Chris doesn't call this a framework. I'm calling it a framework. I just think it was really brilliant. So first thing he brings up is monopoly risk. He asks, what's the risk of a given product can be monopolized and used for leverage against the United States? So the clear example of this, and he spells this out in the newsletter post, is the rare earths from this year. China can extract things from the US, whether it was through the tariff negotiations, future things potentially around Taiwan, because of their ability to mine and provide the world with rare earths and their monopoly over rare earth magnets. So in that instance, if the monopoly risk is high, that would sort of add a point to whether or not you should start building something domestically, in this case in the US. Number two, we're going to go to the right here. I call this flexibility. He asks, how shiftable is manufacturing capacity in a crisis? So he brings up that during World War II, Ford was able to shift focus, and instead of building cars, they started building tanks and planes. But it's no longer World War II, right? We're in 2026 at this point, and is it possible that a car manufacturer could now make tanks and planes to the advanced specification that we do now? Probably not. That seems quite unlikely that they would be able to do that. However, a counterpoint example is during COVID-19, GM was called on to make ventilators, and that was very, very important to providing ventilators for hospitals to take care of sick people. So basically the question is can this manufacturing be reused if necessary? Now, obviously, there's a lot of gray area here, things to think through. The next one's going to have even more gray area. But that is a important consideration, is could this have additional benefits if we need it during a time of war, during a pandemic, etc. Number three, we have the future impact of this manufacturing. Now, this one's really, really difficult to quantify, and he mentions this in the post. How tightly linked are today's ecosystems and tomorrow's? So basically what he means by this, he gives examples that the bicycle industry, so building bikes in the US, led directly to being able to build cars. In China, we saw this more recently. Their smartphone technology, their ability to build smartphones, directly led to their ability to build electric vehicles at a really low cost. So how do you quantify this exactly? It's difficult to say. I don't know how exactly you would do this, but the important thing is it's something you should be thinking about, right? Is this a technology that today might not be super important, but in the future, being good at creating this technology could be the key unlock to, whatever's next. This would force you to have a view on quote unquote whatever's next, but this is an important consideration. And then finally, the opportunity cost and what your goal is. So is shoring up manufacturing the best use of our marginal dollars? So the example Chris gives in the newsletter is if the goal was defense and sort of protecting our ability to get chips, and he was given, I don't know the exact number he uses, but he was given $1 billion, $1 million, whatever the number is. Would he use that to build up the US's manufacturing base? No. He would use that to buy anti-war guns or defense systems for Taiwan and protect them directly versus using the money to build up our manufacturing base. In fact, he says that using those dollars to build up our manufacturing base would be quite low on his priority list because there are more pressing needs in terms of defense and direct spending we could do than sort of overtaking this huge overhaul. That's what I'm leaving here today. I thought those 4 questions were really, really key to consider when we think about should America be rebuilding its manufacturing base. Again, shout out to Chris Miller for his newsletter. For the 3rd or 4th time, it is in the description of this video. Please go read it. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys next week with another educational video.